So guys, thanks everyone for joining our first learning event for the 2020-21 year. We've chosen Reimagine as our theme for the year. We want to encourage and help our members to reimagine how they run their businesses in this new normal world that we find ourselves in. We want our members to reimagine their own leadership style and way of being in this new world. And lastly, we want to reimagine our involvement and contribution to our family lives and the communities in which we operate. So that's the theme for the year. With this in mind, today's talk with Julia is about reimagining how we as leaders, parents, husbands, colleagues, whichever role we play, can deal with anxiety, negativity, and adversity. It therefore gives me great pleasure to welcome Julia. As you saw, Julia is the MD of Luminos Coaching. She has over 20 years experience in coaching corporate teams such as in the financial services industries, companies such as AXA, Barclays, RMB, other companies such as Walt Disney, the University of Johannesburg, and other companies in the mining sector, and also individuals. And somewhat ironically, in handling adversity and building the skill set of courage, conversation, and resilience. You guys would have seen that Julia is one of a handful of Brene Brown certified facilitators in Africa. For those of you who don't know, Brene Brown's TED Talk on the power of vulnerability had over 41 million hits. If you haven't seen the video, highly recommended. I'm sure Julia may allude to it in her talk today. It made Brene Brown a celebrity overnight, and she's also the author of several books, including this Dare to Lead, which is only one of the books that she's written. Julia is also no stranger to our community. We were chatting just before this. She's an entrepreneur in herself, and has also run several talks and workshops with both YPO and EO forums. Julia, thanks so much for making the time. We look forward to hearing your story. I didn't say too much about what happened to you in Bali because I know that you're going to share with us your story. Thanks very much, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Joss, and thank you to everybody that's come online today. I know we're all quite fatigued with online learning and online presentations, so I really hope that today's story, because it's a personal story, also leaves you with some, hopefully some of your own lessons and some of your own insights and as to how you're doing and what's important for you in this time right now. So this talk is called Returning Home from Bali to Bryanston, and it really is my personal account. So this is not the talk where I teach you all about Brene Brown's work or how to build courage explicitly, but I will share some of those elements for you because obviously I had to draw on them myself. But in this, I talk about what were the lessons I learned from my experience of being locked out of South Africa during the level 5 lockdown. And in particular, what are some of the lessons I learned around resilience? So I'm going to go straight into it. Okie dokie, let's get this thing going. Right. So what I'd like you to do, and if you wouldn't mind, is pop your answers in the chat. I'm making the assumption, knowing your forums and the principles by which you guys work, that this is a safe space for you guys to share openly, but to also manage your own boundaries about what you want to put on an open chat like this. But what I'd like you to think about is a time, which could be now, when you felt in deep struggle. And the question I want you to just answer in the chat is, what was the primary emotion you were aware of? If you could just pop that in the chat, please, that would be useful. What was the primary emotion you were or are currently aware of when you felt yourself in a time of deep struggle? So what we're seeing here is, again, a wide range of emotions: scared, fearful, uncertain, helpless, angry, despair, anxiety. Okay, so we're going to come back to these questions. So what I'll take you to immediately is what you noticed is that all of you were first of all able to identify an emotion. and that all of those emotions were kind of wrapped up into what a bundle of emotions that we would call vulnerability. So based on Brené's work, she defines vulnerability, which is an emotion we all experience during times of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. It's not about winning or losing, but it is about the courage to show up when you can't control or predict the outcome. So does that not feel really familiar as to where we all are at the moment? We are all facing collective global uncertainty. Everybody is dealing some level of risk, whether it's financial, business, even health, and of course feeling quite exposed emotionally, having this huge range of emotions the whole time. And she talks a lot about her research, which has covered something like 23 years, 400,000 pieces of data, is that this set of emotions, which we put under the banner of vulnerability, involves the courage to keep showing up with skill, hopefully, when you can't control or predict the outcome. So the next question, which links maybe to the first, is can you think back to a time when you needed to be really resilient? And my question to you, which if you wouldn't mind just popping it in the chat, is what did you draw on, or who did you draw on in that time to make it through? What did you draw on in that time when you were feeling really, really needed to be really resilient? So Bradley, family, friends. So somebody just saying, thinking, almost believing I'll be okay. So having some sense of belief, my partner, friends, brother. Is there anything else you drew on other than support from friends? So yeah, inner strength, etc. Courage. And then the last question here, just to get a sense, is what role did vulnerability and courage play in getting you not only through, but back up again? Just pop your last items there. I'm hearing trust in yourself. What role did vulnerability and courage play? Small, no role, large role, how substantial was it? Okay, so I'm not seeing anyone in the chat there, so I'm going to assume, okay, massive. Thank you, Calvin. That's normally the answer I get. It played a huge role. Yeah. Okay. Right. So what am I aiming at here? Is really to draw the correlation between the emotions we're feeling right now, which make us feel quite uncertain, at risk, vulnerable, in other words, and then looking at what is the relationship between vulnerability, courage, and this ability to get back up again. They work together, like Forrest Gump would say, peas and carrots, they just work hand in hand. So we have to look at what does it take to be both vulnerable and courageous at the same time. And if it's about courage and about resilience, what exactly is resilience? So there are 101 definitions here. This one that I like and I've adapted is it's a life skill, which is the good news. It can be taught and measured. It's a powerful ability to demonstrate courage in order to survive, thrive, and grow in the face of stress, change, and adversity. So if it's about courage, what then is courage? So courage, in my definition, is about being brave, but it's also about feeling awkward, uncomfortable, and afraid at exactly the same time and taking action. You cannot separate them. So in Brené's work, she says that based on her research, that courage is a collection of 4 skill sets that are teachable, observable, and measurable. In other words, this is not just a personality trait if you're an 8 on the Enneagram or a D in the discus profile. This is something that you can actively build and develop yourself and can be taught. These are her skill sets. I'm not going to go into them into too much detail, but what's very important is this ability to rumble with vulnerability, this collective uncertainty that we're all dealing with, and to come out of that more skillful, more curious, and more able to enter into tough and hard conversations and situations in a way that is still respectful. Living into our values, really getting clear on what those are, being brave enough to trust, and then learning how to rise and get back up again, which speaks directly to the resilience piece. What's also very apparent is you can't get to courage without rumbling with vulnerability. Like I said, they work hand in glove. She says embrace the suck. As a South African, I say embrace the cuck, and those are some of the little stickers I've had made. This is a very, very hard concept to get one's head and heart around because, of course, many of us have grown up believing that vulnerability is weakness and in some way means that we're going to expose ourselves and show our nakedness to others. When in fact, the moment we've been most vulnerable, when we've been most courageous, we've actually also been most vulnerable and had to get back up again. So just to close off this small piece, the thing with vulnerability is that it sits at the heart of these very hard emotions: shame, scarcity, fear, anxiety, and uncertainty, many of which people said they experienced or are experiencing at the moment. Now, let's face it, none of us want to feel these. These are the hard, tough emotions we would rather move as far away from as possible. The problem with emotions is that you can't selectively dim one. Like a dimmer switch, you dim one, you dim the whole lot. And vulnerability is also at the core of these core human emotions: love, belonging, and joy. If any of you have ever loved someone, or even if it's an animal, you will know that it is one of the most vulnerable things you can do, to entrust someone with your love, and of course to maybe lose them or fear losing them. It makes us feel incredibly vulnerable. Belonging, we all know that feeling of being excruciatingly excluded from a tribe, from a group, not feeling like we fit in, and also that incredibly beautiful feeling of knowing that this is where we belong and it's our people. And interestingly enough, from all her work, joy is the emotion that makes us feel most vulnerable, because we tend to think that it's too good to be true. The minute we feel any kind of joy, we want to forebode it. We immediately think the hammer's going to fall. So while it's really hard for us to get our heads and hearts around the fact that vulnerability is core to our life, especially right now in the reality we find ourselves in, it's also core to some core human emotions which are necessary for everyday life. And more from a business perspective, it's core to these skill sets. So vulnerability is the gateway to courage, empathy, trust, innovation. And I always say this to people in business, entrepreneurs: if you don't have a courageous culture, a culture where people feel it's okay to robustly debate things, you are never going to get innovation. The best you're going to get is groupthink or status quo. Creativity, accountability, etc. You can read all those lists, but in particular it's about resilience and resetting. This is what takes an enormous amount of courage and vulnerability to keep getting back up again and reset wherever we find ourselves. So what has this got to do with this talk around me going to Bali? So when I was away, and I'll tell you quite a lot about that, many people, asked me to put some kind of talk together or describe what that experience was. And it was only in retrospect, I thought, what's the framework I can use for this keynote? And I looked into Joseph Campbell's work, who is very well known for coming up with this idea of the mono hero and the hero's journey, which is often the core golden thread which runs through many books, many adventure tales, road trip movies, etc. And what it always involves is an unlikely hero, and I'm not saying I'm a hero, but an individual who's called to undertake some adventure, some call to courage. And at first there's a bit of a reluctance to do that. Then there might be some kind of meeting of the mentor, some kind of crossing the threshold, so making that decision and going forward, being tested, meeting both allies and enemies, really going into some deep, dark caves, experiencing maybe some kind of ordeals, and then coming through almost like those 5 stages of grief that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross speaks to, is starting to come to a place where you can see the light at the end of the tunnel, some kind of reward, some kind of road back, some kind of resurrection, if you like, and some returning with an elixir, some kind of lesson. So this is the framework through which I'll be chatting to you guys about, and maybe you can see where are you at in your very own hero's journey, whether that's as an individual, as someone running a business, as a partner, as a parent. Where are you in this journey that we're currently in, which is the COVID reality? So first things first is, where on earth is Bali? Now, some of you may have been there, but I have to admit to you that I was already stuck in Bali when I had to get the world map out and go, where the hell are we in relationship to what? So those little red islands speak to the fact that Bali is one island of Indonesia, of a string of islands in Indonesia. And you can see that it's quite close to Vietnam and in fact to Australia. So it's a long way away and it's 6 hours ahead of us. What do most people go to Bali for? If you haven't read or seen the movie Eat, Pray, Love with Julia Roberts, most people tend to go there for a beach holiday. They have some of the world's best resorts, spas, incredible beach bars, etc. There's also a very big spiritual component to going to Bali. So, going to these beautiful temples, seeing these incredible festivals that they have. They've got a festival almost every day of the week. And of course, going on sort of meditation or sort of mindfulness retreats. Again, if it's your scene, it's also a massive surfing mecca. So I was heading to Bali for a spiritual retreat in early March. And of course, I left South Africa on the 14th of March. This was exactly at a time when we were still thinking about COVID as something that was very specific to the Wuhan area in China and to Italy. Some of the stuff was starting to go down there. So what started happening is I did start questioning, should I really go? I even said to my husband, do you think this is a good idea? And he said, well, I'm not quite sure, but chances are fairly high that you could get stuck. The problem is that conversation took place while we were driving to the airport that day. So I had planned to go to Bali for a spiritual retreat for 10 days with a friend of mine. We planned to get there early and then go on the retreat and really have a beautiful experience of relaxation and then sort of coming back renewed for the rest of the year ahead. What happened is we arrived on the 15th of March to 90% humidity in a small little town of Seminyak, which is normally hugely bustling with tourists. And within 96 hours, the world changed. More importantly, certainly for me from a personal perspective, is within 12 hours, I found myself walking down one of the little streets in this town, which was still, like I said, huge amount of scooters. There were people, but a lot of tourists were being called back to their country. And I badly stubbed my big toe on the pavement in Bali. So I kind of hobbled my way to the nearest ER and being very cautious around infection at the time of, COVID, etc. I immediately went into the ER and I said to the doctor, who didn't speak that great English, please, can you just clean it up and let's get out of here. And within a few minutes, this guy brought in 2 nurses and he asked the 2 nurses and my friend to hold me down while he ripped out my big toe with those forceps and pliers with no drugs, no injection, nothing. So the pain I experienced was excruciating. You could see that on their faces, they were also somewhat traumatized, and it was a very difficult experience to go through within my first 12 hours. So why I share that is because life is what happens to you when you don't have a plan, actually. So what initially had happened is I was meant to go traveling with these guys. That's the only people that made it onto the retreat. So my friend in the blue and the others are the retreat leaders and their children who live in Bali. No one else made it. 20 other people got stopped at the airport because immediately Singapore Airlines canceled our flights. The government announced we were going into lockdown and no one could get in or out of the country. This is where we landed up. This is in Ubud, which is where the retreat center was. You can see a very beautiful, idyllic place with these rice paddies around us. And what started happening, like I said, within 3-4 days, we started to get this realization that we were stuck, and a bit like these ominous clouds, we were unable to get any clarity around what would happen. Of course, we were still in the picture of, well, we'll wait for lockdown to take place. Then they'll send some repatriation flight and we'll wait a couple of days, maybe a week at most, to find out what could happen and we could get back. That's not what happened. One of the things that was quite significant for us is that the reason we'd gone to Bali that specific week is there's a massive festival there, which is their New Year. And for the Balinese people, it is their most precious time of the year in terms of their celebrations. And they cancelled these celebrations in entirety. What they failed to tell us, however, is that during this time, they also cut off all internet and telephone communication. So at exactly the time we were scrambling to figure out how we were going to get home, for 48 hours, we had no access to internet or telephone to even be able to contact our family. So what did we learn from all of this? And I'll unpack the story as we go. I have 7 key insights. The first one is, when you're unable to plan or predict, yes, is this unbelievably vulnerable inducing? Does it make you feel incredibly unsettled? Yes, but there's nothing else to do but be fully present. So we must all be willing to let go of the life we planned, the dreams we've had, the business expansion we wanted to get up to this year. So we get to actually live the life that has been waiting for us. As Muhammad Ali said, life is what happens, and you can have a plan until you get punched in the face, and then you have to deal with the reality of where you are. So we were stuck with this question of what now? What we agreed to do is we agreed that the seven of us would stick together. We were planned to leave Bali on the 29th of March. So we said, let's see what happens. Singapore Airline then closed its borders as well and said no transit flights would be able to take place. So we knew we were locked out of Singapore Airlines. So we agreed to stay in the retreat center. We conducted our own sort of mini retreat while we could, and we tried to support each other as best we could. What we immediately started having to do after that week was up was start to balance what were the gritty facts with gritty faith. Now, many people during this COVID time have mentioned this quote by James Stockdale. If you haven't seen it, I'll repeat it here. He says, you must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you cannot afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. So on one hand, we had to say, look, it's highly likely that we are stuck. What is it that we can do? And how do we still maintain some level of faith and hope around we can get through this? So when we were kind of looking around, is we noticed that the Balinese people, while they weren't in full lockdown, they continued to do their daily offerings of gratitude. They continued to harvest their rice. They continued to have blessings for what was. They showed enormous amounts of gratitude and resilience, and they just kept going. What we did to try and support that process as well is we got together the lists and names of all our friends and family who were really freaking out. This was at a time when you guys were running around trying to sort yourselves out those few days just before lockdown took place. And we did some kind of spiritual ceremony, if you like. Now, this may not be everybody's cup of tea, and it doesn't matter what your denomination was or is, but it was very much a case of how do we actually send some kind of love and support back to the people back home. And what's very interesting is that in putting all those names in there, some of which are on this call, Helen, you were in that little bowl, was really the sense of feeling everybody's enormous anxiety. It was almost like a red hot anti-energy that we could feel. What you also do in times like this is you draw on faith. You might even draw on some kind of superstition around reading cards, etc. And I have to be honest, that is something that we did every day. We would like pull an angel card, give us some kind of divine intervention. And I have to be, quite amazed by the amount of messages we got, whether it was from, birds that flew into our rooms at very strategic times, just giving us a sense of hope, or special messages that we got on cards. The thing with hope is that many will say to you, it's not a sufficient strategy. But sometimes it is. There's some beautiful research by a guy called Rick Schneider who talks about, for hope to be a feasible option, you need to have 2 things. One is what he calls pathways thinking. Can you look into your current reality, and we're all feeling reality challenged right now, can we look into that current reality and try to come up with different pathways that we can follow, different possibilities that we can try and generate in order to keep moving forward and not losing all hope. The second thing you need is what he calls agency thinking. Somebody said it in the chat. Do you have a faith and a belief in yourself that you have what it takes to be able to push through? If not, you will lose hope. Many people at the moment, especially now, 100 odd days past lockdown, are saying, there's nothing to look forward to. We can't plan holidays, etc. But it's like they've started to shut down those possibilities of, are there different pathways? And what agency do they have to be able to affect how they even show up and feel on a day-to-day basis? So this point around hope is really, really vital. And it's something that we drew on a consistent basis. We also drew on our values, these kind of shining lights. What is it that we need to keep doing in order to keep going. And for me, it was certainly trying to be courageous. Like I said, there was something around looking at, gritty faith, not losing hope, etc. But then you also had to look at what were the facts. And unfortunately, in the absence of data, as human beings, our brain needs a beginning, a middle, and an end. It needs a good guy and a bad guy. It needs data. And in the absence of that data, we make shit up. We all know this. We make up stories. We make assumptions. And that's what immediately started happening. First of all, we had to organize ourselves. We got in touch with the DA, the party, a guy called Darren Bergman, who had set up a home away from home group on WhatsApp, because at that point, within that first week, they had no clue where all the South Africans were around the world. They thought there were 600 people outside of the country. It's more like 6,000. We had to organize ourselves into groups, and we got a WhatsApp group specifically for South Africans stuck in Indonesia. Over a period of time, we realized there were 130 of us. And these were people scattered across all these different islands, and they all had very different economic means. Some of them were, surfers who had, gone there, taken their life savings, and they were on month kind of 3 or 4 needing to get home. There were people with heart conditions who couldn't get medication, because while Bali didn't go into a full lockdown, because it's 99% reliant on tourism, everything shut. So no beaches, no temples, no spas, no hotels, no bars, restaurants, clubs, shops. There was, in the little town we went to in Seminyak, where we stayed, one pharmacy and one small supermarket the size of a small spa selling Asian food. When you walk in and you don't know what the hell these vegetables are, even if they are vegetables or if they're still partly alive, part mammal. So there was this real sense of, gosh, okay, if this is where we are, how do we organize ourselves? What also became apparent is, after about 4 or 5 weeks, is that the embassy does not have a mandate to repatriate. In fact, the ambassador was on a yacht just off the island of Jakarta, where he said he didn't want to go into Jakarta because that's where there were some cases of COVID. So we realized not only were we largely alone, but no one was coming. So what we started to do, I come from a PR background 101 years ago, is we got a list of all the editors, newspapers, radio stations, etc., and we kind of divided it up across the administrators within our group. And immediately we started writing press releases, and we created an enormous noise, something like 45 different media releases. And what we started noticing is that while the government in South Africa was saying, yes, by all means, those that are outside of the country can return, there was no way for us to get back. Every single airline had closed its airlines, and of course South Africa wasn't allowing flights in. So we started having to put together a campaign around how do we get back home. So we were on TV, we were on radio, etc. Of course, what was also happening was, let's face it, quite a lot of fear, but also a lot of humor was coming into the mix. A lot of those crazy memes that people were sending around, and these really also kind of helped buoy us up around what was going on collectively as people were trying to make sense of this. What was very distressing was we kept hearing about these different flight options that were available to us, which we would hear about, and then we'd realize that they were a scam or they weren't going to take place. What happened is, after about 6 weeks now, Cyril had announced that the lockdown would have been extended. I remember that was the day before Easter. And so we woke up on Good Friday, which I then called Bad Friday, realizing that there was no ways we were going to get home before probably middle of May, because lockdown had been extended. Then we knew we'd have to go into quarantine. We knew it would probably take time to organize some kind of repatriation, and that really just felt like an incredibly difficult time. What we found out through 101 different mediums, because every day on this WhatsApp group that we had with 130 Indonesians, is we had about 850 messages every 45 minutes. Think about that. 840 messages coming through every hour or so that you have to trawl through to see what's real, organize it, correspond to the embassy, etc. Is we found out about a South African who had been living in Australia for 20 years. He was a good Samaritan, you can call him. And his name was Arno Nell, and he was very good friends with the CEO of an Australian charter company called Monarch Global. And he started telling us about a possibility of a charter flight that could take us back. But of course, it wasn't flying to Indonesia. It certainly wasn't flying to Bali. It was going by Australia and New Zealand to collect these individuals so that they could then pick up the Australians and Kiwis in South Africa and return them home. So I'll pick that story up a little bit later. But in the meantime, we had to organize ourselves and make quite a big noise. The third lesson in all of this was and is give yourself permission to feel the full range of emotions. Why is this important? Is you're going to find, and as you would have found, is that some days you're going to be feeling, quite upbeat, plans are working accordingly, and allow yourself to feel that. The next hour, it could feel that you feel deflated, really, really anxious. It's kind of like if you feel anxious, allow yourself to feel anxious. If you feel sad, allow yourself to feel sad. Because when you do so, you limit the spikes of these emotional highs and lows, and you allow yourself to just accept what is happening for you in the moment. I love this quote by Mary Oliver. Someone I loved once gave me a box full of darkness. It took me years to understand that this too was a gift. So if you can see that some of your emotions that are coming through, sometimes you're cycling through many a day, if you're able to name them, recognize them, allow them their airtime, see what the gift and the message is in them, you're more likely to feel more emotionally well through this period. I guess what was, very emotional for us, bear in mind my friend Julia had left her 2 children who are 18 and 16 back home. Her family and her ex-husband live in another city. She was very worried about their well-being. And of course, my husband was left home here with my stepchildren, etc. And everybody trying to just, man the fort and get used to what was going on, was how to bridge this distance. So what we would find is that we'd wake up first thing in the morning, we would set up our offices, we'd wait for South Africa to wake up at midday, and then we'd work till sort of 8, 10 at night, just trying to catch up, because both of us are coaches, and of course our clients are needing our support and assistance at the same time, which was particularly trying because we were quite low on reserves ourselves. But I guess those messages that you might still be receiving, and certainly what we were receiving around, hang in there, better days are coming, were really, really helpful, and really not wanting to give up. You're loved, you got this, etc. And, of course, speaking to the work and courage that I, love to teach, is we often get to teach that which we most need to learn. So this one is actually a quote from Winnie the Pooh that says, "You're stronger and braver than you think, and more loved than you will ever know." And that kind of sentiment, I think, is very important for all of us to keep holding on to each day as well. The fourth thing is do what you can with what you have. We know that it's limited right now. We know there's many things that we don't have that we would probably really need and want. The problem is that you've got to be able to say, well, I can't look back in anger or resentment. I can't look forward in fear and anxiety. I've just got to be where I am now. And where is that? Can I look around in awareness? And what was very vital for me certainly was to realize that I wasn't lost. I wasn't abandoned. People kept saying, oh my God, you must be going through this terrible ordeal. There's, 101 worse places you could have been stuck. And that's true. But we weren't lost. We were here. We were in Bali. So there was something around what is it that we do with where we are and what we have. So every single day we would say to each other, have we done whatever we can with the resources we have to try and progress our cause? And if the answer was yes, that was it. That was all we could do for the day. And if not, we would had to get into activity and gain some perspective in that way. And what was hugely valuable was really drawing on mindfulness. Now, I have to be honest with you, mindfulness has always sort of got on my nerves a little bit. I'm very nouveau mindful. I've always intellectually got that it's important, that it's really valuable, that many people gain much benefit from it, but it's certainly never been something that I have been able to get into any practice of. And what we were able to do every single day was do an hour of Deepak Chopra's. We followed one of his mindfulness meditations, and we just sat and just processed what we were dealing with in silence. And some days it was a lot more peaceful, and other days it was hell. And I can strongly, strongly recommend looking at mindfulness as a really, really important, not only tool, but practice for these difficult times we're in. We also had to look around us and say, well, what can we do? Bear in mind, everything was closed. We made some incredible friends, local people, that offered on occasion to take us out. And one time they took us to these beautiful terraced rice paddies. And again, normally this is 1,000,001 people here. We were very fortunate to be the only ones there. But again, it's a huge sense of sadness and sort of, surreal experience of being there completely alone, but no less taking in the beauty of that. The other thing I realized, and I guess I'm always going to be working on it, is this need to stalk out joy. Because when you can find a place, whether that's inside of you or outside of you, for me it's in nature where there is joy, that joy will always burn out the pain. Now this picture is what they call the Bali swing, and you go out over these huge canopies of trees. And I'm absolutely terrified of heights, but I knew this was something that I needed to do to just access a feeling of joy and not anxiety and vulnerability on an ongoing basis. And it was one of the most lasting memories that I have there. This book also really, really supported me. I strongly recommend it if you haven't got it, or at least go online and look at some of the images from this book. It's written by Charlie Mackesy, and it's called The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse. And little messages in this book really supported me. And many clients, friends, family started sending me these messages, this idea of, I can't see a way through, said the boy, but can you see your next step? If the answer is yes, just take that. And if you can't see that next step, stay and stand where you are. So really, really beautiful messages coming through around that. The other thing was to get busy working. This was we did a 365 certified facilitators with Brene Brown. This happened at 3 o'clock in the morning with a different time zone. And we really felt it was vitally important to keep working, to figure out what is it that people were needing through this time and continue to provide a service to them. What we also did is we wanted to respect some of the traditions in Bali, which are to put out offerings. And we found this beautiful deserted beach. It's a volcanic beach. And we put out one of these little chenangs, which are these offerings that you put out to say thank you for whatever is. For me, it was also about needing to connect with nature. And this little beagle was actually the only animal that we could see and touch for the 9-week period that we were there. A beautiful little guy who went around on a scooter, and really just missing those very essential things. The fifth one was knowing when to surrender, to fight, and to just keep going. So you'll recall me saying that we met this individual virtually, a guy called Arno Nell, and he mentioned to us that he was in contact with the head of this company that was a charter flight. We soon realized in dealing with DIRCO and the various government departments that we would have to organize our own charter flight because they said the SAA flights were not available. So right at the end of April, early May, we discovered that this flight was now a viable option. We managed to convince them to come via Bali and Jakarta, because 100 people or more were in Bali and about 120 and about another 20 were sitting in Jakarta. And we managed to get them to agree to go from New Zealand to Australia to Bali to then Jakarta and then on to Johannesburg. However, in order to book a charter flight, you must understand the cost of these things is enormous. I don't know if any of you are in the air industry, but it's approximately 30 to 40,000 for a single one-way ticket. Now, some people could not afford that. There were families of 5 who'd been traveling. They had been stuck there for weeks on end and were pretty desperate at this time. We even had a woman who had a very high-risk pregnancy, who, if she did not get on a plane within 3 weeks, would have had to have had a baby on her own in Bali without her family near her, which was very risky. So we found out about this flight. We had to get 70 or 80% of people onto this flight in order to make it viable. We had to set up payment options because people didn't have credit card facilities, etc. We had to draw up legal documents. We had to attest to the fact that this company was a legal listed entity in Australia, that they were the real deal. The different administrator groups of these different regions, New Zealand, Australia, Indonesia, had to buy into it. And as a result, we were having to go all the way up the line to speak to ministers of government in each of those different regions to say, please, could they put a video together? Could they put a press release together to please say that this was a viable option? And in fact, it was our only option at that point in time. So over a 5 and 10-day period, we were working 14, 15-hour days trying to get this initiative going. We were also having to get people from these different islands to one of these centers in Indonesia. At exactly the same time, we were trying to mobilize people, get them convinced to buy these tickets to get home, the Indonesian government closed all domestic travel, so we couldn't travel between provinces or islands, plus they had Ramadan. So now we were having to organize cargo ships to smuggle people from different islands to get them to the main centers. We had 5 days to do this before the plane left. What happened is we managed to get about 75% on the Sunday night, and we needed to get the full quota of 80% or more by the Monday morning in order to get the flight manifest ready, in order to give it to DIRCO and all the various government departments across all these different regions and countries, as well as to open up airspace with AXA, etc. We went to bed that night very confident that this was going to happen. For 5 days, we hadn't said a word to our family about us coming home. And that Sunday night, we both said, you know what, we're going to tell our families. And we phoned them and we said, we're coming home on Friday. This is what's happening. It's very exciting. And we took that risk. And the next morning we woke up and I saw 4 or 5 missed calls from Arno Nell. And he phoned me and he said, Julia, flight's been cancelled. And it was absolutely devastating because I said, I don't understand. Did we not make the numbers? What happened? And he said, there were 2 reasons, Julia. One was, and it's very hard to say this because I'm a very proud South African, but we had very, very senior political level interference in that flight coming into South African airspace. The government did not want the negative publicity of an Australian charter flight bringing us home, especially since these raucous 130 Indonesians had made so much noise in the media. The second thing that transpired was on our WhatsApp group, we had 4 administrators. These were young people appointed by the DA to coordinate information. There were 4 youngsters from Cape Town that run a small personal trainer gym, etc. And they had done a wonderful job coordinating, gathering information, people's data, passport numbers, etc. And unbeknownst to us is that they had made it clear that they were not sure that this flight was actually viable. They thought it was a scam. A lot of people had actually booked many, many flights, paid even more money over to various airlines for those tickets not to be refunded to them. So they'd lost a lot of money. So what we didn't know, and what Arno shared with me, and he said, Julia, and my friend was also called Julia, do with this information what you will, but if you don't, I'm going to go live with it. And what he told us is that those 4 individuals extorted 4 free tickets from the CEO of the charter company and said that if they did not get those 4 free tickets, that they would influence and convince the rest of us as a group that this was a scam and that it wouldn't go ahead. So they would use their positional power as leaders on this group to make sure the flight didn't happen. So the minute we heard that and that the flight was cancelled, I can honestly say it was one of those really, really dark days because we had decided that we would leave no one behind. And at the very last minute, this flight got cancelled. So this idea of knowing when to surrender. And I can honestly say that at that moment when we realized the full extent of this, that we had to phone our families and say, it's not happening. We had to tell this group who had committed so much money, so much time, so much energy that they were not going home, was just devastating. And it literally felt like someone removed my skeleton and I just lay down on the floor. And that day was a really, really dark day. What then happened is we sat on this information around these 4 administrators for a couple of days, not a couple of days, a couple of hours. And then unbeknownst to us, this guy Arno now, I think, felt his own sense of integrity around this. And he put a very scathing live video on Facebook where he named and shamed a number of members of the government. I'm not sure it would have been my approach personally, but he also made it very clear as to where the interference had come from. And he named these individuals that had acted so unethically. What happened for us that day is, ironically, we had arranged a farewell with our friends in Bali to say goodbye. And on the way back, of course, we realized we didn't know how much longer we were going to be there. We were devastated. We walked down this little avenue and we saw this amazing, what's called a waringi tree. I think in English, we call it a banyan tree with these beautiful old ropes of branches. And there was something very moving about this tree. And I can remember just feeling absolutely exhausted and just going up to this tree and just seeing that this tree must have been about 100 years old and had overcome so much. You can see literally its roots growing over this ancient kind of little temple and shrine. and just really getting an enormous amount of relief. And you might think I'm crazy, but almost like I hugged this tree of like, my God, if you can get through this, maybe we can too, you know. And we went home that day and we kind of just called it quits. Like, there's some days you just got to put a pen through it and say, no more day today. Like, it's ending now. And of course, you know, there's something around, if you don't have the skills to get back up, you may not risk falling. And if you're brave enough, often enough, you're definitely going to fall. So there's something around, how do you get back up again? And interestingly, what got me back up again was rage. This white hot anger as to what had happened. And in particular to these guys on our group who we had entrusted, we had offered support to, we had given them authority to, you know, lead us. And what happened is Arno put that video up, and very slowly it started filtering into this group that this is what had happened. And the primary administrator, let's just call him Justin, he denied. He lied about it. Meanwhile, we had all the facts. We had evidence of the manifest, of the complimentary tickets, etc. And he tried to shift the blame, and he started threatening the two of us Julias independently. And for me, it was like I could not stand there for one more second without actually saying to him, enough, stop this. You're a disgrace. You have let us all down. So for me, I don't like to engage in anger. It feels quite scary for me, but feeling that I had to step into that arena and actually really fight for the people that didn't necessarily have a voice and didn't know the full truth was really, really important. And I guess the last thing is knowing when to keep going. If any of you have ever run, I've done a few half marathons, is that many people, certainly my clients have done a lot of comrades marathons, is they'll say that the halfway mark of any marathon is not whatever the full distance is divided by 2. It's literally those last 7 kilometers, that last tiny effort, which feels like halfway, because the amount of energy, the amount of resources you have to draw on to just keep pushing through that last minute, those last, you know, miles and kilometers is what takes the most amount of energy from you. So what we found is, once that flight had been cancelled, once we'd kind of allowed ourselves to just fully surrender to what was, once we'd had an opportunity to, you know, voice our disappointment, our anger, to get these guys to step down from the group and just sit with whatever was for the next day or so, what immediately happened, which I think was probably a plan being hatched in the background, was South Africa came forward and announced that there would be a repatriation flight. The date changed 3 or 4 times. It was a huge inconvenience. None of us could get particularly hopeful until we could start seeing going. But those last few days and weeks were some of the hardest for us to pull through, because we just didn't know what we could believe in. The other lesson through this was learning the international languages of humor, empathy, and kindness. We met some of the most incredible local people, from the ladies who took care of the little villa that we were staying in, to this driver who was an Uber driver who became a friend. He would tell us where to go to the markets, etc., and he would take us on drives. And the patience and the kindness and the goodness we found in those people, as well as the many, many people on our WhatsApp group, was astounding. Now, that picture on the left is what we call snake fruit in Bali. And one day, our driver, his name was Andika, we had gone quite a long drive with him, and he'd kind of shown us some of the sites, like I said, those terraced rice paddies, etc. And we'd given him, you know, probably, because we'd always say to him, how much do we need to pay you, Andika? And he said, no, whatever you like, whatever you like. So we'd given him quite a large sum of money that day. And about 45 minutes after he dropped us back at our place, he knocked on the door and he arrived with this massive bag of these fruits. And he said he wanted to give us these as an act of kindness, to say thank you for how kind we've been to him. And we tried to pay him. We tried, you know, had this whole exchange, and he said, absolutely not. You've been kind to me. I want to be kind back to you. And so I guess what we're finding, and through all these times, is when you have these improbable scenarios which lead us to have the whole world turn upside down, you see improbable behavior from many people, some really poor, the worst in people, and always the best in people always comes to the surface as well. So here are some photographs of some of these wonderful people that we met. what we've decided is that any proceeds we make from these keynotes, 50% go back to these individuals. So there's Andika on the bottom left. They're the ladies who took care of us, did our washing, brought us fresh water, etc. So what then happened is on our last day in Bali, when we found out, no, this flight is definitely taking place, we went as close to the beach as we could. And we felt it very important to thank Bali for everything it had given us, including the pain and the suffering. And we made our offerings there and then at the beach. And it was a beautiful full moon that night. And it was quite a mixed set of emotions around leaving and also this anxiety of getting back home. That's us bottom right with a number of people, because what we did is we realized we couldn't just leave South Africans home. Were there any Africans in Indonesia? So we've got two people there from Zimbabwe and a lady from Namibia that we also got on board, and about 125 of us got on that flight. There's the ambassador, Dr. Hilton Fisher, who we spoke to on a regular basis, and their team were pretty phenomenal. Once they'd fired up the engines and got going, decided to help all of us, and the repatriation flight was unbelievably seamless. What was very emotional for all of us is to walk through an airport where there's not one other person other than these 130 people that you've been arguing with and having dysfunctional fights with, etc., on a WhatsApp group. What was very interesting is that a number of people, went and confronted the 4 administrators that I spoke to you about, and some of them were gracious and some of them weren't. What we also found quite amazing as this SAA crew, they came through, there was an eruption of people singing and clapping, and it was incredibly emotive. And every single one of those individuals, it was a big crew, were all volunteers. They had all gone into isolation for 10 days before getting on the flight, and they would also go into quarantine for 2 weeks after the flight. Had a long chat to one of them in the galley that night, and I said, what made you do that? I mean, you've left your families. I know how hard that is, and you're not being paid. And she said, all of us here at SAA have worked for this company for over 20 years. It's family. And if this is the last SAA flight, which was highly probable at that time, we want it to be one where we go and fetch our South Africans and bring them back home. So an incredible story of people being really selfless. So that's us finally back on the flight, the 2 Julias, as we came to be known. And then, of course, it was like, where are we going to land up in quarantine? We were very fortunate. We got to go stay at the Balalaika Hotel there in Sandton, got big rooms. And again, what was that about? It's about a lesson in mindset. Many people really, really battled with this idea of you could not leave your room. You could not have people visit. You could not have many things brought to you personally. You'd have to have them delivered to the front gate, and they'd bring them in because all the people in the hotel were also in forced quarantine. Some people totally and utterly ripped apart their rooms. They went crazy, and other people just said, well, how are we going to make the most of this time? They did online dancing, did meditation, and made the most of the time that they had there. So again, what is the mindset that you have through these processes and times? Fortunately, we were able to get our tests done quickly, so we were able to get out of 7 days, and finally we were able to go home in the middle of May. So the last thing is around. This was from a little cafe that we'd found in Bali called Shelter, which is enjoy the little things. One day you'll look back and you'll realize they were the big things. And for us, and for me in particular, this was vital. Because the 7th lesson is around returning to what's truly essential. And for me, that was being with my husband again, who I hadn't seen for 9 weeks. That was the happy reunion outside the Balalaika, being in connection again with my animals, who are like my children, and very simple things like the pleasure of 5 Roses tea. I can't tell you how I will never travel anywhere without my little bag of 5 Roses tea going forward. So what's truly essential for you, and how do you also return to yourself in some way? So there's just a list of some of those lessons I've covered off. So no planning, no predicting, only presenting. That's all we can largely do right now. We can plan to a certain degree, but you've also got to keep very, very present to what's actually going on, balancing those gritty facts with gritty faith, allowing your full range of emotions, working with what you have, and keep testing. Have I made use of all the resources I have, including my own inner resources? knowing when to surrender, when to fight and to keep going, really learning those international languages of humor, empathy, and kindness. They really are life skills that can be taught and practiced and grown, and returning to what's truly essential. So for me, people have asked me, well, you know, how do I define courage now? And for me, it's about living from the inside out. It means in every uncertain moment, turning inward, listening to my own deep inner knowing, and speaking and taking right action from that place. Because what else do you got to do? So just lastly, Joseph Campbell, again, the guy from the Hero's Journey, said that life is without meaning. And I know many people are really struggling with meaning, purpose, their why, their, you know, sense of hope right now. And the fact is that we bring the meaning to it. The meaning of life is whatever you ascribe it to. So being alive is that meaning. And I can certainly tell you that I'm finding this time really struggling being back home. I'm finding it's incredibly strengthening to have friends and support and family around. It's very hard to hear the struggles that people are going through, but I also feel incredibly grateful and alive every day, knowing that this is what it means to be alive right now. So there's the hero's journey. I wonder where each of you are right now. Are you feeling tested in some deep cave? Are you feeling that you're returning to yourself in some way, getting your businesses or your mindset back on track and having some lessons that you can now move forward into the new known world with? And from my side, just to say thank you for listening to my story. It's a very personal one, as you can hear. And this is a beautiful sign that we saw somewhere in Bali, which says peace, love, and nasi goreng, which is their favorite chicken dish. And I wish that for all of you as well, not only well-being in your businesses, but, you know, health and well-being, and that you have a greater sense of your own abilities and resources to be able to move forward through this time.
And thanks so much, Julia. Gosh, I'd heard bits and pieces of your story through our conversations, but listening to you, in my books, you certainly are a hero. I don't know how you got through that, but it certainly gives me a lot of courage to know that everyone's going through something and their own journey. So thank you so much for sharing that story. We have gone over time, but if anyone's got any questions to ask Julia, please go ahead. I know there's a lot of comments coming through saying thanks so much for sharing, inspiring, amazing story. So maybe just quickly while we wait, Julia, how's your toe?
My toe is healing. It looks really ugly. I'm very grateful for the fact that it's winter and that I can keep my feet clearly ensconced in socks and shoes.
Brilliant. Guys, I really appreciate everyone tuning in. This was our first, thank you, our first learning event of the year. I appreciate you dialing in. I know everyone's got a lot of Zoom fatigue, etc. What we would love you to do is Laura's going to quickly post a link. If you can give some feedback on the talk, please keep close to your WhatsApp messages on the Thirst for Learning group for future and upcoming events. Our next event is with Stephen McGowan on the 29th of July. There's also a surprise event that's going to be announced soon on the 30th of July. And then the 5th of August, we also have a gender-based violence discussion with Professor Benita Maisfeld. So thanks very much, everybody, for joining. And Julia, once again, thank you so much for your time. It's always amazing to see you and hear from you. And Laura, also a big thank you for arranging everything. Oh, and a big thank you, which I meant to mention right in the beginning, was for Veronica, who has set up all the videos in preparation for this and the PR for the event today. I don't know if Veronica's on, but big thank you to her for helping us with that as well. Thanks, everybody.